My name is Marcel Bryant Price, but most people know me as Fable or Fable the Poet. I was born in Lansing. I was raised between Kalamazoo and Ypsilanti, and for the last about 13 years, I've called Grand Rapids home. At first, when I thought of poetry, I didn't ever think that I could see myself or anybody who I would gravitate towards in it. I was a sophomore, junior in high school. I was failing my high school English class pretty badly. And a teacher, Miss Whitley, told me that I could turn in a piece of creative writing every day. And if I did, that she would give me a passing grade. And I thought that that would be better than continuing to get in trouble at home for not doing well in school. So every day I turned in something. It was song lyrics. It was short stories. It was whatever I could conjure up. And at the end of the year, Miss Whitley said, there's this camp that I think you should go to. It's called the King Chavez Parks Camp, the KCP camp. And every year on the east side of the state, a bunch of schools send black and brown kids to colleges so that you can stay in the dorms and really experience the college experience to see if that might be for you. And I was really poor and did not think that college was in my stars. But she also said that there was a writer's camp that she thought that I would really, really like. The reason that she thought that I would like this camp is because as I was going through this creative writing process with Miss Whitley, she informed me that Tupac was a poet and gave me his book, The Rose That Grew Through the Concrete. And as soon as she put that book in my hands, all I could write was poetry. There was something about seeing that book and it being in his handwriting. And I listened to Pac so much. He was like such a source of my creative inspiration that seeing his work and holding it and feeling like I was really experiencing it, like he wrote it for me, made me enamored with poetry. So then I started turning in poetry every day. So when I went to the KCP camp, there was a writers group that was ran by the Ann Arbor Poetry Slam team. And there was a guy named Slayman, who again was the first Black person who did poetry, who I ever saw in person. And he showed me that poetry could be whatever I wanted it to be. At the time, I was going through a pretty complex upbringing at home. And a lot of what I was writing was in traditional fables where animals were speaking in place of human beings. And I did that as a way to not dive into vulnerability and talk about what I was experiencing at home. And in that writers group, they gave me the pen name Fable, which would later grow after diving into other areas of community. But that's how I became involved in found poetry. For a long time, it very much separated real life me from the me that I wanted people to experience. For a majority of my life, I drank pretty heavy. I'm somebody who comes from a family of addicts, drug users, drinkers. And although I know that, I oopsie daisied and fell into alcoholism. And for a long time, Fable was that guy who would go to the bar and buy everybody shots. Fable was that guy who was always loud and taking up space. In normal me, at least anybody who knows me really well knows that a lot of times I'm pretty quiet. I'm really an introvert. I'm not very outgoing and boisterous and loud. I'm very much to myself. So that gave me the opportunity to be what I thought it would be exciting for people to soak me in as. And it gave me an identity to climb into my story in a way that I never felt brave enough to be able to do. And I think that having that stage name, that persona for a long time brought me to be who I am comfortable with in my own skin today. Although for a long time it was also a hindrance because I caused a lot of harm in my early years, just being this wild tornado of a human being that swept up so many people in my wake. I move with this undetermined certainty through life of like, I believe that things are going to work. Grandiose things. And I think young me felt destined to be something. Because growing up, I was made to feel so small, or like my imagination or what I could dream up with wasn't feasible. So I think that I always was like, we're going to do this. And I just never knew what this was, but I knew that I wanted it to be art, and I knew that I wanted to tell stories, and I know that I wanted to create something that felt bigger than me. So I think young me would be like, I knew it. Even though I don't think young me believed it, I think he felt so certain somewhere in his bones that it would be. I don't know of a singular moment that has felt especially grandiose. I feel like so many things in my life feel very, very large. When I became Poet Laureate, that felt grandiose. But then it spiraled into a nonprofit organization that ended up becoming $1 million organization working with tens of thousands of people, and that felt grandiose. There was a time where going on a poetry tour for 3 months and stopping at 12 states, starting at New Orleans and ending in New York, and being on the road, seeing all of the best shows in the country and meeting all of these poets felt grandiose. There was a time where speaking at some of the best colleges and universities in the country felt grandiose. And now we're gearing up to create a hub for cultural art and create a youth center in our neighborhood. And again, it doesn't feel as grandiose as I think some people look at it and think of it as, because there's also so many things in life that are happening that feel larger than that. Like, for example, my wife being diagnosed with terminal cancer and being in the process of dying right now at age 30 feels way larger than any of those things. Growing up in an environment where you were constantly scared feels larger than all of those things. So I think that none of the endeavors that I pursued through poetry or the ideas that I tried to dream up ever felt so large and unobtainable as peace felt unobtainable. Favorite poetry spots in the country. One, right about now in Houston, Texas, at Avant Garden. Beautiful. We don't get spots like that because we live in Michigan and we have snow in winter and fall. So it's a beautiful outdoor venue. Nuyorican Poets Cafe, the staple. It's like a mecca for poetry. The energy when you walk in the space is absolutely obnoxious. There's people looking down on you from the upstairs. The host started with everybody dancing. It's a riot. But in the top 3, my favorite spot would be the Drunken Retort. It would be the spot that we created here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that was legendary, that poets wanted to come to from across the country. And I feel really privileged and honored to create something that not only was my favorite, but was so many people's favorite. That's cool. How did the retort come to life? Oh, man. So I was a young poet looking for community. I was living in Kalamazoo, and every week I was driving to Grand Rapids, Michigan for this show called Smokin' Spoken Word. Ran by this gentleman named Azizi Jasper. And there were so many poets there. There was this guy who was co-hosting the show. His name was Greg Bliss. And this guy was loud. I didn't even know if most of the things that he said made sense. I don't know if I could actually tie the lines together in my head, but I knew that he was yelling and I knew that it felt exciting. And I was like, this is incredible. And the group of people that were there were Black folks and Asian folks. Keegan Loy, Soul was performing like I'd never seen people performed. And I was like, man, if I'm gonna do this, like I did it at like high school talent shows, but if I'm gonna do this, I gotta take this so much farther. So I started thinking to myself, how can I learn all of these things that they do best, you know? And it's like they were all masters of different elements. Greg was boisterous and Keegan had performance and Azizi had this smoothness to him. And I was like, how do I take all these different elements, the fire and the air and the water, and combine them into something that feels different and exciting? So I was in the process of soaking this all in. And while I was soaking this all in, he was like, yo, you've been coming for a few weeks. Where are you from? And I told him I was living in Kalamazoo. And he said, why are you driving to Grand Rapids every week? You know, we have a show in Kalamazoo. So I started going to Smokin' Spoken Word in Kalamazoo. So I didn't have to drive to Grand Rapids every week. But eventually I missed the vibe in Grand Rapids so much that I was like, I just think I want to move there. So I made the choice to move to Grand Rapids. Back in those days, there was this huge event called Art Prize, this national art competition that felt like an explosion of art in Grand Rapids. There were pigs as tall as buildings and fire-breathing dragons and murals bigger than I had ever seen. I mean, at this time, I've never been out of Michigan in my adult years traveling. So this felt like big city stuff. This felt exciting. In Ann Arbor, there was a lot of arts and culture, but it didn't feel as explosive and vibrant as this. And seeing and being around all of this art, it made me think to myself, how much bigger can we do? How much bigger can we go with this? It doesn't just need to be a show. I mean, so many people come out to this show. What if we do a blind, deaf friendly art project with this? And at the time, the people who I was collaborating with were all regulars at this show. And it grew from spoken word at the Hookah Lounge at that time to being The Message, which was a show at the Bob hosted by Azizi Jasper and Mitch Burns, who Mitch, Poet Like Poe, was a poet in the community for a few years. He was also working at the Bob at the time. And there was a core group of people. There was also Vincent Dix. There was Duke Green, aka Third Person. They were in a group called Punctuate, taking over the city at the time. And there was Gleason, who was around all the time. And there was Sean Moore. And there was this guy named Foster, aka Autopilot. And Foster was like, you know what? I really, really, really want to start a show. And at first I felt like if we made too many shows, we might oversaturate the scene. And that pressure was bestowed upon us by the people who were really doing a lot at the time. But I really started gravitating to the idea of what if we did something different, you know? And Foster had these ideas of, well, what if we put everybody in a circle? And what if you perform in front of everybody when they're in a circle? Or what if we make people hold water in their mouths and you try to make them laugh and spit it out? And I was like, man, all those things are exciting, but like, what if we have like a set of rules? Like, what if we have like things that really make this show what it needs to be? And that became the 4 rules of the show. Number 1 was like the yell rule. You got to get loud. Number 2 was the tell rule. You got to tell people about this show. You got to take pictures. You got to post this on social media. Like, this is not Fight Club. You got to talk about this. Number 3 was the swell rule. Like, you got to snap. You got to clap. Like, you got to get loud. Like, this is not a place that is meant to just contain energy. And then there was also the boo bell rule, which really set precedent in that show. there was bells on every single one of the tables. And if you rung those bells and three bells went off, people yelled, "Get the fuck off the stage." And it made it to where a certain level of talent came to that show. And because of the energy, because of the noise, it became my favorite. It became a lot of people's favorite. There was people who were singing and dancing on top of bars as they were playing guitar and reading poems on the top of bars, and people walking up and down the aisleways, and on art prize years, these rooms would get so full that people would literally be shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm together. And it became something that got put on Grand Rapids' You Must Experience list. And before we knew it, news coverage was coming to our show and hanging out at the show. But also these world-class poets started reaching out and being like, yo, I want to come to the show. Like we had Hanif Willis, National Book Award winner, at this show. We had Donez Smith at this show. Franny Choi at this show. Poets were flying in from Scotland to perform at this show. It was remarkable. And it went for 7 years. And when I went to places like the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and I went to places like Right About Now, and I went to places like Say What in South Carolina, I was blown away by these communities, but also reminded of what we had and how extraordinary it was and how big it was, and how we were truly doing something that nobody else in the country was doing. How has my mental health impacted my poetry? I'm somebody who writes a lot about what I see or what I feel, be it writing about the city around me, writing about politics and what I see going on in the world around me, or writing about what I'm seeing and feeling. And during one of my stays in Pine Rest, I was given a journal, and I was told that my creative outlet could be a tool for me to talk about what I was going through. And a little after that is when I really started to write about my mental health. Poems like Don't Mind Me, as well as creating my first collection of poems. It was really about what it was to be a person of color, a Black man who's holding mental health issues in America. I'm somebody who over time has started to get a little bit of business savvy just from really seeing how things work around me. And I started to look into how are poets making money. And a lot of poets were making money from getting performances at colleges and going to these conferences. And I thought to myself, there has to be other ways that you can connect with conferences. So I started thinking to myself, well, a lot of my poems are about mental health. What if I reach out to the people who do mental health conferences? So I started reaching out to places like Mental Health America, NAMI, in the Anxiety Resource Center of America, all these different places. And I started giving them my press kit, the same press kit that I would later use to apply for Poet Laureate. And before I knew it, these places were like, yo, we've never heard poems like this or coming from somebody who looks like you. And I got invited to these conferences to perform. And at these conferences are a bunch of other people who work in the mental health field that are all scattered across America. And before I knew it, people were inviting me to UCLA to speak to clinicians of color from all over California, and to DC to speak at the National Mental Health Conference. And it just started to organically trickle out and spread. And before I knew it, I was reading and talking about my mental health a lot. And I don't know if I thought about my mental health as much until I was doing those performances, and there were all these Q&As and people were asking about my experience and what I was feeling and how I was going through it. But even as I was doing all of that, I was really in tune with my depression and my bipolar disorder and my anxiety. But there's still so much that I didn't really know about my mental health. For example, again, when my wife got diagnosed with terminal cancer, I started having panic attacks. And I think that I might have even thought that panic attacks were like made up. Like they just seemed so I was like, oh, panic attacks, that don't seem real. Until I had one and I was like, ooh, that's not to be messed with. And now my writing is again rooted in my experience and in where I'm at. So the way that my mental health impacted my poetry is, for a long time it was debilitating, but it gave me a career. And the way that my poetry impacted my mental health is it now gives me an outlet and a way to digest it and process my thoughts in a way that is so much slower than at the fast pace my brain constantly moves. The story about the power of poetry for a community. When I came to Grand Rapids, Black people were doing poetry at the few places where they felt that they could do poetry. Through poetry, I saw the first Black Poet Laureate in our city. Through poetry, I saw the first Black Poet Laureate that didn't have a college degree. I saw the youngest Poet Laureate in city history. Through poetry, I saw the first Black woman to be Poet Laureate, the first openly queer person to be Poet Laureate. Through poetry, I saw schools that refused to bring us into their schools because some of our teaching artists were queer. And I got my eyes open to the culture in which Grand Rapids really has in its bedrock. I saw schools refuse to have us back because we talked about young people having guns pulled on them by police officers. I saw poetry awaken students in talking about how unfair their dress code was and pushing to get their dress codes changed. I've seen poetry get students to stand up in front of their entire schools and to talk about how they're being sexually abused at home and have the freedom that I didn't have for so much of my life. And I've seen poetry get young people to come out and to identify in the way that they see fit and in the way that is truly within them. I've seen poetry impact tens of thousands of young people. And now I've seen poetry inspire people to move to Grand Rapids and start careers in Grand Rapids. I've seen poetry inspire people to start shows in Lansing and to start shows in Detroit and to start shows in Kalamazoo. I've seen this little thing that we've built start to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and spread. And that's how I've seen poetry impact community. It started as something that was so small and that just felt like community, like you could touch it. And it became something so big and organic that you can't even quantify the reach because you can't see how far it's going. On an individual level, I grew up poor. We grew up poor. And me and my wife bought our house in this neighborhood. Poetry gave me the social capital. The space that we're sitting in used to look like it was in a time machine. We redid the walls. These chairs got donated by Steelcase. This work all got revamped and paid for. The social capital of poetry helped us go door to door in this neighborhood and give direct cash assistance to hundreds of neighbors in our neighborhood. It's inspired my friends and gotten my friends paid. I now see poets with health insurance and benefits, you know? We're creating even more positions. We're about to have a youth center in our neighborhood that's going to change the trajectory of a business district that's forgotten about, that is filled with Black and brown folks. So the power of poetry, man, I think it's so much bigger than anybody actually knows. It's about talking about the world around you and dreaming about what could be. But when you take it off the page and put it into the world and you just dream about what can be and then you make it a reality, that comes from the power of poetry. the poem that really started to talk about my upbringing and the impact that my little brother's dad, my stepdad, had on me. That was really, really, really hard to articulate. I think men oftentimes have a really hard time being vulnerable and when they were the victim, and also men have a really hard time in being vulnerable at the times in which they caused harm. And not talking about the why, but actually just talking about the harm. And I think that my work that talks about harm caused was also really, really hard to write, because then I saw it become real. The poems that I'm writing about my wife are really, really hard to write. Again, I think because it becomes even more real. There's something now that like I'm reveling in not writing and just being in the moment. My mom was a photographer. She went to school for photography, and she said that she got to a point in life where she had to stop taking pictures and actually live in the moments that she was capturing. And now I'm in the process of living in so many moments and not writing. But I feel like when I get to the point of writing again, there's going to be so many hard poems, but poems that I'm going to be excited to write because I actually took the time to live in all of the moments. Yeah, so again, poetry took me places that I never necessarily thought I would go. Again, I was a poor kid who was from Michigan. In my adult years, I had never been anywhere besides, here. Michigan was all I knew. And the co-host of one of the co-hosts at the time, there's actually two. There was Foster and Gleason. Foster was like, man, you really need to take this show on the road. At the time, I had never traveled to do poetry. I'd never gone to any of these conferences. I was just performing locally. I was just performing in the state of Michigan. And the idea of traveling outside of Michigan to perform gave me so much anxiety. It made me absolutely terrified. And I was like, I don't know how you even do that. He's like, well, you drive. You drive out of Michigan. And I was like, you just drive to a bigger city and just perform poetry? And he's like, well, yeah. And I was like, it can't be like that easy. It can't be that. So we went to the Green Mill, which is another one of the most historic spots, probably one of the most historic spots in the Midwest, hosted by Mark Smith. And we performed in their poetry slam, which is the oldest running poetry slam in all of America, and won it. And I realized at that point that I didn't just have the chops to perform in Grand Rapids, that I could be heard elsewhere and appreciated elsewhere. And that was an important seed and catalyst in really getting me out and feeling like I was worthy enough to have my work heard somewhere else. The Grand Showcase. I was really excited that John Hunting brought up the Grand Showcase when we were sitting here, just because it's one of those amazing events where, again, you had to be there. So the Grand Showcase was the largest, I know, in Grand Rapids history, singular poetry event. I mean, we did the event at Fountain Street Church. We had one year probably over 500 people. Another year, we probably had closer to 600 plus people there. Our students opened the event. Some of the best local talents performed. We brought in regional headliners who were big names, up and coming names in the business. And we had these huge headliners. And in Grand Rapids, as far as I knew, a lot of these headliners came to like our universities. They come to GVSU, they come to Calvin. But a major part of my interest is Poet Laureate was not just having poetry live in academia and really pushing it out to people. And again, our group, our collective was so good at events, at nightlife events, at doing poetry events in the community. So we thought, what if we did our own festival? So we made this event called the Grand Showcase, and we brought in all these sponsors. Mr. John Hunting, who's in this documentary, was one of the sponsors who made it possible. Stella's Lounge, who we did our nightlife event at for 7 years, helped make that possible, as well as a slew of other donors. And that's when I started to see people actually like physically invest in poetry. Grand Valley University was investing in poetry. Calvin College was investing in poetry. And that's when I realized that we could fundraise around this. And also when I realized that universities didn't have to be the people who were doing these shows, that we could do it. And if we did it and did it right, then people would come out in droves, because our shows were some of the most diverse shows that I had ever seen. And the people filling Fountain Street Church were equally diverse. They were Black, they were brown, they were queer, here to see these poets who were, again, just as diverse as the people in attendance. And that is the grand showcase. I'm excited to bring it back. COVID put a damper on it. But I also needed a break from doing it, because it was me and Gleason doing everything with the diatribe for a while. And I didn't have the energy. So thank COVID for putting a pause on it. Yeah, so the diatribe originally started off as a collective of artists. It was 7 different artists. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the work that we do is heart work. The work that we do is rooted in people, and people are complex. And the more people you work with, the more complex it gets. So when we started to do, or when we fell into youth work, we were doing these events at Art Prize, these pop-up shows, 2 pop-up shows a day. And we didn't ever know that Art Prize had a huge education component. So we're doing these 2 pop-up shows a day, and there's buses of kids coming in to watch us perform. Huge crowds. And before we knew it, these teachers were like, hey, have you ever thought about doing what you guys are doing here in schools? And at the time, we were like, absolutely not. We were, again, dealing with a lot of substances. We were doing a lot of drinking. We were doing a lot of nightlife activities. We were closing down the bars very often. And these teachers were like, no, seriously, can you guys just come in for one day? And I was like, seriously, I don't think that's a good idea. So we went into one school, and it was like a career day of sorts, which we shouldn't have been doing a career day. We were making no money doing poetry. We were very poor. We were struggling to pay bills. There's no reason that we should have been talking to kids about, you can do this for a living, because we weren't. But that's what we did. We went in and we told these kids that, hey, you can do this. Look at us. You too can do this. And kids were blown away. They believed too that they could do it. And before we knew it, actually, a whole class wrote us letters and asked us to come back into schools. And at the time, I reached out to the collective of 7, and I said, hey guys, this school wants us to come in. And most people were like, perform for a bunch of kids? No, that's corny. Absolutely not. Or they were like, my raps are not meant for schools. We're going to get kicked out. But there was a select group of people who were like, you know what, that sounds interesting to me. Gleason was like, that sounds interesting to me. Stephen Grin said, that sounds interesting to me. Foster, aka Autopilot, said, that sounds interesting to me. Mitch Burns said, that sound interesting to me. But at the time, I was like, we need more help than that. So we also inducted this guy named Sean Moore into the diatribe. And he was more passionate about young people than I think all of us put together. And before I knew it, so many schools started reaching out and asking us to come in. And again, we were not at a point in our lives where we should have done that. There were days where we were going to schools and one kid one day was like, you smell like my uncle. Like there were some days where we woke up after closing down the bar and went into school, probably wasn't brushing my teeth enough. I probably smelled like PBR in whatever I was drinking at the time, tequila, Fireball, whatever. But also, that is what led me to stop doing a lot of things. For a while around that time, I was selling a significant amount of cannabis. And that's how I was supplementing income on top of performing. And I got to a point in my life where I was like, if I get caught doing this and I go to jail, I'm going to lose everything that we're building. So I chose to stop and put all of that energy into doing this work. And at the same time, somebody who I kind of saw as a mentor, his name's Jack Wohler. He worked at the Grand Rapids Children's Museum. He was like, have you ever thought about taking what you're doing and turning it into a nonprofit? And I was like, again, I don't know if I can do that. I barely graduated high school math. I think I cheated my way through school. That does not sound like something I can do. But he was like, you need to put together a board. People who know how to do the things that you don't know how to do. You need an attorney, somebody who can do all the bylaws, somebody who can get you registered. You need people in curriculum development experience. You need teachers who can get you in contact with other teachers. And he kind of gave me the framework of what I wanted and needed. And I've always been somebody who's really good at getting pieces. And I had been performing in the community for a long time, talking about what I was seeing around me. So people were really excited to be a part of it. And in our first year, I think we did like $40,000. And it felt amazing. Schools were paying for us to come in. And we were paying artists, and it felt so cool. And before I knew it, we were in 10 schools and 5 schools and 20 schools doing one-offs and whole assemblies where all of these artists who we were working with were performing in front of all these kids and talking about our lives, and then working with the kids for 6, 9, or 12 weeks at a time. And it started to grow to where we were able to pay bands to come in and hip hop artists to come in. So we were paying other artists that we had been working with in the nightlife community for so long. And we started paying videographers and photographers. And next thing I knew, we were $120,000 organization. And it's like, oh man, this is cool. This is more money than I've ever seen. And it just continued to grow and grow. And before the pandemic, we were in like 30 schools in a 12-month rolling period. And we were in 20 schools, and our budget was only $150,000. So we were not taking care of ourselves. I realized that looking back. So I'm like, we're doing more than some of these huge nonprofit organizations, and we are not making any money. But then the pandemic came, and again, I'm somebody who doesn't like to stop. One of my good friends, Gleason, our education director, just got a house when the pandemic came. And another one of my good friends, Foster, just had a baby, a preemie baby, my god baby, Josie, when the pandemic came. And all of schools closed. Arts organizations were folding. The UICA closed their doors. And I was thinking to myself, like, man, how do we exist? And also, like, how do I take care of my people? So then I started dreaming even larger. You know, I was like, what if we take what they're learning in the schools and we plaster it on the walls in our community? And then George Floyd was murdered, and I was absolutely offended by the way that the city of Grand Rapids reacted to that. And I was like, what if we started doing liberated art? What if we started reclaiming our neighborhood using art? What if we taught people about what our kids are learning in class through an art project? And next thing I knew, we were doing 7, 8 murals. And next thing I knew, we had salaries and benefits. And next thing I knew, we were doing 20 schools a year still between online programming and in-school programming. And then our budget was $650,000. And then things continued to grow. And every organization in the city wanted to work with us. And before I knew it, we were sitting down with city commissioners and the city manager and mayors and state reps and senators that are like, tell us how to get better. And we told them through poetry. And that is the story of how the diatribe was and got to where it's at now. And along the way, we needed a whole lot more teaching artists. So some people phased out, again, because people are complex. Their views change. Their opinions change. Some people never wanted to do youth work in it all. But then there were poets who did. And there were people like Kid Kane, and there were people like Angela Cluley, and there were people like Sprout, KFG, and there were so many others, Amanda Small, Say Ron, and before we knew it, our former students started to want to be interested in teaching, and Nisi became a teaching artist, and Elvis, who was in one of the very first schools we were ever in, expressed that he wanted to be a teaching artist, and again, it just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And here we are today. I first heard the term Poet Laureate in 2014. I was a young, scrappy, drunk writer. And I said, I think I could be Poet Laureate. And I applied. And I heard nothing back. And this guy named Lou Klatt won. And I said, who the fuck's Lou Klatt? Because at this time, the world revolving around me, I didn't know who this guy was. I'm like, I don't see him at shows. I don't see him marching in the street. I don't see him losing his voice on Monroe Avenue. Lou Klatt? What? So at that point, I decided that Poet Laureate was only for the academics. That it just wasn't something that was for me. That what was for me is what we were building. What was for me, what was for us was the work that we were doing in community, the work that we were doing with the kids. But again, around that time, I started getting involved with Mental Health America. I started getting involved with all these other organizations. Some of these organizations started to ask for a CV. And I was like, what's a CV? So before I knew it, I was like, apparently I need a CV if I'm going to perform at some of these institutions and places. And I started, again, learning all this stuff that comes from academia, right? But I didn't learn it through academia, again, because I didn't go to school. So I started making my version of a CV. A lot of CVs have all your professional accomplishments and accolades. And my professional accomplishments are shows. So I listed all the shows that I did, all the tours that I've done, all the places that I've gone, the shows that we've started, the shows that we ran in Detroit and Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids. And that's what my work became. And so many people's CVs include publishing credits. And I'm like, man, well, the credits that I have with shows reach way more people than some of these people's dusty books. So I said, that's what goes on a CV. So 3 years passed by and I'm bitter and I'm fired up. And it's 2017. And I say, you know what? Now I'm ready to apply for Poet Laureate. So I put together this CV and I'd reached out to one of the best graphic designers we know. So I was like, I bet you their CVs are regular on black and white paper. I'm gonna have an artist make mine super fucking fly. So I'll show them. So I turned in this CV that was designed by one of the best designers in the city, littered with shows that we'd done, schools that we had been in. It was unignorable. And it also had a grandiose plan. I told them that we were going to make a nonprofit, that we were going to work with more youth than they had ever seen, that I would leverage this title to really dream big and do some of the biggest shows, make festivals. And I think that they received the CV and the people on it were just like, who the fuck is this guy? And what does he think that he's really he's gonna do poetry festivals? He's gonna leverage this to make a nonprofit that pays artists for time. But I don't think that they realize that I'm not somebody who just dreams, that I'm somebody who's willing to outwork every single person around me. And then I'm not just somebody who talks big, but I'm willing to match my talking with actual action. And I use that leverage in becoming Poet Laureate and getting the cover of Grand Rapids magazine and all of the press that came with that to really pour it into our youth work more than just center it on, oh, it's the Marcel show, it's the Fable show. And I use that leverage to take what we were doing and give it the traction that it needed to push it into the stratosphere that it is now. And that is how I became aware of Poet Laureate. I didn't know what the Dire Eyes Poetry Competition was. I had never applied for the Dire Eyes Poetry Competition. Again, there were just certain things that just felt inaccessible to me. So I didn't really know much about it until one year, Miss Christine Krieger asked me to be a judge of it. And that was really, really cool because that year that we were the judge, we also had a bunch of our students apply. Regina Cassesi, who won KDL every year, and then also ended up working with Dire Ives and Miss DeYoung, Francesca, who performed at the Grand Showcase, and it was just really, really cool. And I started to have this really fond appreciation for Dire Ives. Just especially because after that year where I was a judge, I was asked to also present Mr. John Hunting with an award. And John Hunting is the guy who who really made possible the Dire Ives Foundation, which made the Poet Laureate possible. So he's the one who really even made it possible for me to become Poet Laureate and started this competition that lasted for 50, 60, 70 odd years. And it impacted poetry for generations. And I was like, man, this guy is making a lasting impact on poetry like I want us to. So I really started to have an appreciation, if not for the competition itself, for the history and the impact of the competition on Grand Rapids. I'm somebody who likes to do a lot of work really out of the box. So all of the work that I have has not only been work on page, but I've created audio versions of the work that's scored, work that's mixed and mastered and has live instrumentation over it. And when you go to a lot of these publishers and you're like, hey, I have this body of work, they're like, cool, that's a good book. But you're like, yeah, but you need to do something with the audio too. And they're just like, wait, what? Not audio. We're not going to do something with all of that audio. But outside of that, I've always kind of felt that the way publishing works is really predatory and inaccessible. So you want me to submit 5 poems and pay $30 or $25. What if I do 100 submissions a year? We're talking what, $300 just in submission fees that I might not even get back. There were times where I wasn't even making $300 on a show. So I have to do 3 shows to be able to apply for 30 contests. Like when you're living full-time off art, it just didn't make sense. And a lot of times I felt like they were really gravitating towards people who were these really technical writers, especially because the majority of my career, contemporary poetry wasn't nearly as popular and didn't have the nuance that it has now. So a majority of my career, I never had success in the realms of publishing when it came to poetry. A small press out of Texas picked up my first book, and I sold like between 1,000 and 2,000 copies of that book. So I was really proud of that, just because I know people who have published 20 collections of poetry and sold 30 books each. And like to actually like have the marketing power to get out books and have people demand it enough, that showed me that like it didn't just need to be technical to be appreciated and to be desired. And that maybe I was writing for people who didn't go and gravitate towards all those other books. Most recently, I worked for 2 years on a collection of poetry called New American Monarch. And it's an extroverted caterpillar's. It's an introverted caterpillar's guide to becoming an extroverted butterfly. And it's a full collection of work with a full audio book. And one of my dream publishers, one of the biggest publishers in Michigan, wanted to pick it up. And I sat down with them. They were like, this collection is astounding. And I said, I have to be honest with you guys before we sign this publishing deal. And I started to talk about the complexities in my life, harm that I had caused, the person that I had been. Just because if we're creating this big of a business arrangement, you know, these things might come up. And also it's important to me to be accountable, even though a lot of it's talked about in the book, for who they were really signing this agreement with. And they took that words, they were like, thank you so much for being transparent. And they took that information back to their head of publishing and their publishing department. And they chose to not go through with publishing the book. And since then, that was like a year and a half ago, I really had the wind taken out of my sails. And I've just been sitting on this collection that is a really remarkable book. From front to back, it's great. The illustrations are from local artists, live instrumentation, scored, mixed, mastered. And the work too on paper, it's really great. It is technical as well as it's easy to digest. But now I'm just sitting on it. And I just now started to try to look for a home for it again. But again, the world of publishing and academia has never been good to me, even though I can sell books. I think that they really look for something that fits the mold that they're looking for. And I think that what I might be best at is doing work here and doing work in community and dreaming big and making those dreams possible and not signing contract with book companies that are going to give you $2 on a book. And then, yeah. This is a poem I've been reading a lot lately. It's to my wife, Nika, who I hope will be around to see this documentary, but might not be. I wrote this the first time she was diagnosed with cancer, before we knew it would become what it is today. No one writes a poem for the partners of the soon-to-be survivors. So I etched this one in my ribs for the ones with smiles like theater masks, for the ones with hair-triggered laughs and tempers like dry fields that haven't felt the warmth of French kissing lightning yet, for the ones with shoulders made of stone that feel they can't afford to crumble, the non-denominational dream catchers of prayers, well wishes, hope, whatever good juju people can conjure up that day and serve up hot. You see, this one is for the tin folk, scarecrows, and lions, for the bastards that never felt love until they realized it could leave without them even pushing their loved ones away. This one is for the people who have ixnayed on running because you are too scared to even move now, much less look for the fire exit when it feels like your world is aflame and your feet are rooted in the here and now. Don't worry, I wrote this for the stable and the quick to validate too. The ones that been good and healthy before good and healthy was a reaction fueled by fight or wanting to fly your ass away. This is for those stuck in fight or flight. This is for those that just want to fight because it feels so much safer than feeling. Or the ones that can't find their wings in their overcrowded closets, junk drawers, or backpacks stuffed to the lining with coffins and bones. I wrote it for those, a tongue, a record skipping on the words, I love you, I love you, love, I. This is for those that can't help but selfishly be focused on the I, because every time they think of the latter, they tear themselves into pieces, somehow Elmer's gluing themselves together for their you. I wrote you a poem. I wrote me a poem. It reads, no one writes a poem for the partners of the soon-to-be survivors or the partners of the lost. So many are focused on their loved one that maybe not even you can focus on yourself. If your loved one ever asks you to be strong, and you, like me, ain't never been the best at doing the best for you, here's a secret. Self-care ain't even just for self now. Everything needs to be selfless. Tell your reflection that you are being the best you that you can be for them and believe that shit. Move the needle forward. Let the record play past love. Sit there for a while until it ends. And listen for the thunder, whether it comes or not.